My name is Sarah, and I am 30 years old. To understand my story, you must first understand the geography of my family's gatherings. They were less about kinship and more about cartography, a living map of power and influence where everyone was acutely aware of their designated latitude. At the center of this universe was the main table, a long, polished mahogany behemoth in my Uncle Robert's cavernous dining room. This was the prime meridian of our clan, the place where the sun always shone. To sit there was to have arrived. It was reserved for the loud, the wealthy, the connected, for men like my uncle, who ran a successful construction empire, with the kind of backslapping bravado that passed for charm, and for their wives, like my Aunt Carol, who dripped in jewelry that seemed to chime with every condescending laugh. My cousins, with their business degrees and their talk of stock options and German cars, were gradually earning their squires' seats at this court. And then there was my family. We were the distant Chile coastline on this map, a territory often spoken of, but seldom visited with any genuine interest. My father was a high school history teacher, a man whose richness lay in his mind and his quiet integrity qualities that held no currency at the main table. My mother was a nurse, her hands skilled in care and compassion, skills deemed utterly pedestrian by a family that valued net worth over human worth. We were not poor, not in the true sense of the word, but in the context of our relatives, we were paupers. Our modest book-filled home was a source of thinly veiled pity. Our second-hand car was a punchline. My parents' decision to value education and public service over profit was seen as a character flaw, a lack of ambition. From my earliest memories, I was taught the cardinal rule of these gatherings: be invisible. Don't speak unless spoken to, Sarah. My mother would whisper, her hand tightening on my shoulder as we walked through Uncle Robert's ostentatious front door. And for heaven's sake, don't offer an opinion. My father, a man who could hold a classroom of teenagers wrapped with tales of the Peloponnesian War, would become a ghost, nodding silently as his brother-in-law pontificated on tax loopholes and the laziness of the modern workforce. We were the background scenery, the silent, humble audience required to make the performance at the main table feel grand. I learned to fold myself into small spaces, to make my presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. My contributions were limited to yes, thank you, and no, I'm fine. And my primary function was to help clear the plates of those who had feasted on both food and their own self-importance. I would watch them from the kids' table long after I was a kid, and later from a small, rickety card table set up near the kitchen, a designated outpost for the less significant. The conversation from the main table would drift over a cacophony of booming laughter stock tips and casual dismissals of the world. I found fascinating the world of ideas, of social structures, of justice. They spoke of people as assets or liabilities of communities, as markets to be exploited. I would sit there, a silent volcano of thoughts and counter-arguments, and say nothing. The message was clear, etched into every condescending glance, and every dismissive wave of a hand. Our branch of the family tree was withered, fruitless, and certainly not strong enough to support a seat at the table. The family's verdict on my future was delivered with the same casual certainty as a weather forecast. "She's a smart girl," Uncle Robert once declared, patting my head as if I were a golden retriever. "But quiet. She'll marry some nice, sensible boy and be a good mother." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a pre-written, single-sentence biography. My academic achievements were met with a polite, vacant smile. When I announced I was majoring in public policy, a field I had fallen in love with for its potential to architect a more equitable world, my Aunt Carol tilted her head. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Is that like being a politician's secretary?" My cousin Mark, who was then a junior analyst at a brokerage firm, helpfully clarified, "It's basically government work. No money in it." The consensus was that it was a quaint feminine pursuit, a hobby to be indulged before the real business of life, marriage, mortgages, and proximity to the main table began. When I graduated with honors, my parents were immensely proud, but at the family barbecue celebrating my cousin's promotion, my achievement was a footnote. My uncle toasted his son's killer instinct. I received a pat on the back for finishing school. It was in this environment of profound underestimation that my secret life began. I didn't set out to deceive them. I simply stopped trying to include them. The effort of translating my passion into a language they could understand, only to have it devalued, was too painful. So I went underground. After graduation, I took a position with a small, fiercely dedicated nonprofit focused on housing advocacy. My office was a cramped, perpetually cold room in the basement of a community center smelling of stale coffee and righteous indignation. My family thought I was doing charity work, a benevolent pastime. They had no concept of the reality. My days were a brutal grind of sifting through municipal codes, writing grant proposals that felt like screaming into a void, and interviewing families who had been chewed up and spat out by the very systems my relatives profited from. I would sit on the stained couches of people living in condemned buildings, listening to their stories, the raw data of human suffering, and I would transform their pain into meticulously researched reports. I compiled statistics on eviction rates, cross-referencing them with public health outcomes and school truancy. My work wasn't about charity. It was about justice. It was about using the unsexy, unglamorous tools of policy to forge weapons for the powerless. It was in that basement office that I met Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a retired law professor who volunteered with us, a man with a mind like a steel trap and a gaze that missed nothing. He was the first person outside of my university professors who saw me not as quiet Sarah, but as a mind to be reckoned with. He would read my policy briefs, his pen scratching furiously in the margins, and then call me over. "Ms. Evans," he'd say, his voice a low rumble, "your analysis of the zoning variance impact here is not just sound, it's devastating. You haven't just identified the problem, you've exposed its root system." He never praised my diligence, he praised my intellect. He never told me I was good. He told me I was necessary. Alistair became my mentor, my confidant, and the sole witness to my burgeoning career. He was the one who encouraged me to submit my research to academic journals, who coached me for my first presentation at a regional housing conference. "Your family doesn't see you," he told me once after I'd made a vague, pained reference to them. "That is their failing, not yours. Do not ever mistake the limits of their vision for the limits of your value. Your work speaks for itself, Sarah. Just make sure you're in the rooms where people are willing to listen." And so I did. The disconnect with my family widened into a chasm. I stopped attending most gatherings pleading work commitments that they assumed were flimsy excuses. When I did go, I was a ghost, offering even less than before. My life was bifurcating, and the real, vibrant, consequential Sarah was a complete stranger to the people who shared her blood. For 8 years, I lived in that chasm. My life became a study in contrasts. By day, I was immersed in the high-stakes, low-glory world of social activism. By night, or on the rare occasions I saw my family, I reverted to being a phantom. The work was my true north. I remember one project in particular, a campaign to secure funding for legal aid for tenants facing wrongful eviction. The city's official narrative, a story my Uncle Robert would have proudly repeated, was one of urban renewal and progress. But on the ground, I saw the truth. I saw the renewal for what it was: displacement. I spent months in the city, archives my fingers stained with the dust of old ledgers and zoning maps, tracing the lineage of discriminatory housing policies that stretched back decades. I built a database, not of numbers, but of people. Maria, a single mother of 3, whose building was being converted into luxury lofts with a week's notice. Mr. Henderson, an elderly veteran on a fixed income whose rent was being illegally tripled. Their stories became my armor, their trust, my mandate. I would work until 2 or 3 in the morning, fueled by coffee and a cold, hard anger. My apartment was a chaotic mess of binders, legal pads, and highlighted reports. The walls were covered in flowcharts and maps pinning eviction hotspots. This was my real home, this fortress of data and human narrative. And slowly, painstakingly, the work began to bear fruit. A series of articles in a local investigative journal used my research as their foundation. A city councilwoman, a young, fiery idealist, took up our cause. Small victories began to accumulate like snowflakes, eventually creating a blizzard. We won a temporary moratorium on no-fault evictions in a key district. We secured a pilot program for tenant legal services. These were monumental achievements in my world, hard-won battles that changed lives. But I couldn't share them. How could I possibly explain the significance of a successful injunction against a slumlord to my cousin who had just returned from a ski trip in Aspen? How could I describe the tears of relief in Maria's eyes to an aunt whose primary concern was the caterer for her next garden party? I tried once. It was a Thanksgiving dinner, and I was feeling a rare flicker of hope, a small glow from a recent victory. My cousin Mark was holding court, bragging about the massive year-end bonuses at his firm. "It's a bloodbath on the trading floor," he said with a grin. "But if you're smart, you make a killing." When there was a lull, I cleared my throat. "My organization just helped stop a mass eviction downtown," I said, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. "We proved the landlord was violating the Fair Housing Act." Uncle Robert looked at me over his wineglass. "The one by the old shipyard, we're bidding on a contract to demolish that whole block. Full of vagrants and criminals. You're probably making it harder for the city to clean the place up, Sarah." Aunt Carol chimed in. "Honestly, dealing with those kinds of people all day must be so depressing. Are you sure that's healthy?" The conversation immediately pivoted back to Mark's bonus. I felt a door slam shut inside me, the deadbolt sliding home. That was the last time I ever tried. My achievements became my secret garden, a place I nurtured in private, its colors and fragrances unknown to anyone in my family. The silence wasn't just a habit anymore, it was a policy. It was a necessary act of self-preservation. My professional life was a vibrant, thriving ecosystem, but to my family, I was still just a barren patch of land. The transition was so gradual that I barely noticed it myself. The line between being a researcher and being an authority began to blur. My briefs, once just ammunition for others to fire, were now being sought after by the architects of policy themselves. The fiery councilwoman who had championed our cause won a seat in the state legislature, and she took me with her not as an assistant, but as her chief policy advisor on urban affairs. The basement office was replaced by a small but sunlit room in the state capitol building. The title on my door was unassuming, but the work was not. I was no longer just advocating from the outside. I was now on the inside, helping to draft the legislation I used to dream of. My world became a whirlwind of committee hearings, late-night legislative sessions, and closed-door meetings where the future of cities was debated. I learned to navigate the complex dance of politics, to speak with a quiet authority that commanded attention not through volume, but through an unshakable command of the facts. My mentor, Alistair, watched my ascent with a kind of paternal pride. "I told you to find the rooms where people listen," he said over lunch one day. "It appears you've started building the rooms yourself." It was his recommendation that opened the next door, the biggest one yet. Senator Thompson, a man who chaired the state's powerful appropriations committee, was launching a major task force on long-term urban and economic development. He was a political heavyweight, a man whose endorsement could make or break careers, and he needed a senior advisor to lead the research and strategy wing. He wasn't looking for a political operative. He was looking for a brain, someone who understood the granular reality of the communities his policies would affect. Alistair put my name forward. My interview with the senator wasn't about my resume. It was a 2-hour deep dive into housing theory, economic models, and the social impact of infrastructure investment. We argued, we debated, we found common ground. I walked out of his office with a job offer that made my head spin. I was to be his senior policy advisor. This was the great secret. My family knew I had a government job, now a vague and uninteresting concept to them. They pictured me in a gray cubicle stamping forms. They had no idea that I was spending my days briefing one of the most influential men in the state that my reports were the foundation for multi-million-dollar budget allocations, that my name was known and respected by lobbyists, academics, and political leaders. I was living a complete double life. I would sit in a high-stakes negotiation, holding my own against seasoned power brokers, and then get a text from my mother. "Your Aunt Carol is asking if you're bringing a dessert to Sunday dinner. Maybe that nice apple crumble?" The dissonance was jarring, almost comical. At a family wedding, my Uncle Robert pulled me aside. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with condescending charity, "my company has an opening in HR. It's mostly paperwork, but it's a stable job, better pay than whatever you're doing. I could put in a word for you." I just smiled and said, "Thank you, Uncle, I'll keep that in mind." I didn't have the energy to explain that my unstable job involved crafting the very public-private partnership regulations his company would soon have to follow. The secret became a heavy cloak, but also a strangely comfortable one. It shielded me from their judgment and allowed me to focus on the work. The woman they saw was a quiet, unassuming 30-year-old with a dead-end job. The woman I was becoming was a force, and her power was forged in the silence they had so long imposed on me. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a dense report on transportation infrastructure and a memo from the senator's chief of staff. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, the kind that feels important even before you read it. It was for the annual Local Development Strategy Conference. My heart didn't just sink, it plummeted. This conference was the social and economic pinnacle of the year for the regional elite. It was a day of schmoozing, deal-making, and self-congratulation, all disguised as civic engagement. And this year, the conference chairman, the man whose face was smiling smugly from the bottom of the invitation, was my Uncle Robert. This was his coronation. For weeks, my mother had been relaying updates. "Robert is so busy, you know. He's organizing the whole thing. He's getting the senator to speak." She'd say, a note of impressed awe in her voice that always made my stomach clench. The senator, Senator Thompson, my boss. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. Of course, my family had no idea of the connection. To them, the senator was a remote, godlike figure that their patriarch, Uncle Robert, had managed to summon. The entire family was expected to attend, to fill the tables and serve as a claque for my uncle's grand moment. For me, attendance wasn't optional. Senator Thompson was giving the keynote address, an address that I had spent the last 2 months co-writing. My presence was required. I was to sit at the head table with the senator, the mayor, and the other dignitaries, ready to provide any data or talking points he might need. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. This was the inevitable collision I had been avoiding for nearly a decade. My two worlds, so carefully separated, were on a direct crash course. The image of it played in my mind, on a loop, my family decked out in their finest, basking in Uncle Robert's glory, and me walking in as part of the senator's official delegation. What would I do? What would I say? For days, I was paralyzed with anxiety. The old programming was kicking in the childhood whispers of, "Be silent, be humble, be invisible." A part of me wanted to feign illness, to invent a crisis, to do anything to avoid the confrontation. I pictured Aunt Carol's face, the mixture of confusion and contempt. I imagined my cousins snickering. I felt the familiar shame coiling in my gut. Then I thought of Alistair's words. "Do not ever mistake the limits of their vision for the limits of your value." I thought of the families I had fought for, the legislation I had helped shape, the sheer, unyielding effort that had brought me to this point. My work was real. My success was real. Why was I letting the imagined judgment of people who had never bothered to see me dictate my feelings? The dread didn't vanish, but something else began to crystallize alongside it, a hard, defiant resolve. I wasn't the timid girl at the card table anymore. I was a senior policy advisor. I had earned my seat. The question was no longer whether I could face them, but whether they could face me. I spent an entire evening picking out my outfit. Not a flashy dress to compete with my cousins, nor a drab suit to fade into the background. I chose a simple, impeccably tailored navy blue sheath dress and a string of pearls my father had given me for my college graduation. It was the armor of a professional. It was the uniform of a woman who belonged in the room. I wasn't going to the conference to prove a point. I was going to do my job. And if my two worlds collided, so be it. I would not be the one to break. The ballroom of the downtown hotel was a glittering spectacle of manufactured importance. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, casting a golden glow on the sea of dark suits and cocktail dresses. The air was thick with the murmur of networking, the clinking of wine glasses, and the scent of expensive perfume. It was the natural habitat of my extended family, and I spotted them immediately. They had claimed a prime table near the front, a satellite of the main dais, and Uncle Robert was in his element, moving from group to group, his laugh booming across the room, accepting congratulations for an event he had organized, and for a keynote speaker he believed he had personally secured. My parents were there, looking slightly overwhelmed, my father in his best suit, and my mother clutching a small handbag as if it were a life raft. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and began to walk toward the registration table, my path taking me past their position. My mother saw me first, her face lighting up with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Sarah, you came?" Her voice was a little too loud, drawing the attention of the rest of the family. All eyes turned to me. It was Aunt Carol who intercepted me, her smile as bright and hard as the diamonds on her wrist. "Sarah, dear," she said, her voice dripping with the patronizing sweetness I knew so well. "It's so good you could make it. We were just saying how nice it is that you have the day off from your little office." She placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that was less about affection and more about steering a vehicle. She leaned in conspiratorially. "Now listen. The main tables up front are for the dignitaries and the sponsors, you understand. It's all very political." She gestured with her head toward the back of the cavernous room near the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. "Robert had them set up a few extra spots for family. There's a place for you over there. You can probably see the stage if you lean a bit. The main table is not for you," she added, giving my arm a final dismissive pat. "Please sit outside." It was the line I had been hearing in one form or another my entire life. "You don't belong here. This space is not for you. Know your place." The hot flush of shame, a conditioned response honed over 30 years, washed over me. I felt the familiar shrinking sensation, the urge to apologize, to become invisible, to retreat to the designated periphery where I wouldn't be in the way. I could feel the eyes of my cousins on me, their expressions a mixture of pity and smug confirmation. There's quiet Sarah being put in her place. I looked at Aunt Carol's perfectly coiffed hair, her self-satisfied smile, and the absolute certainty in her eyes. And then something shifted. The shame receded, and in its place, a profound and tranquil clarity settled over me. It was like watching a movie whose ending I already knew. The scene was predictable, the lines were hackneyed, and the actors were playing roles they had long ago perfected. But I was no longer in the cast. I was in the audience, I had moved beyond this tired family drama. I didn't get angry. I didn't offer a rebuttal. I didn't flash my credentials or try to explain. I simply looked at her, held her gaze for a silent moment, and gave a small, serene nod. "Thank you, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice even and calm. And I turned and walked away, not toward the back of the room, but toward the dais at the front, leaving her standing there with a look of slight confusion on her face, as if she couldn't quite process my lack of protest. For the first time, her words had no power. They were just noise, and I was finally blessedly deaf to them. I walked with a calm purpose that felt entirely new, a silent shield deflecting the curious and condescending stares that followed me. I bypassed the family table, ignored the overflow seating near the kitchens, and continued directly toward the elevated head table on the main stage. There were name cards set in small silver holders, and I found mine easily. Ms. Sarah Evans. It was placed between the mayor's card and an empty seat reserved for the Honorable Senator James Thompson. I pulled out the chair, smoothed my dress, and sat down. The act itself felt momentous, a quiet declaration of my own. I could feel the ripple of confusion from across the room. I didn't look at my family, but I could sense their collective gaze, a tangible force of disbelief. I imagined the frantic, whispered conversation. "What is she doing? That's not her seat. She's going to embarrass us all." Uncle Robert, I saw from my peripheral vision, was staring, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. He was probably moments away from storming over or sending a staffer to have me removed. Before he could act, the house lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the podium. The master of ceremonies, a local news anchor, welcomed the attendees. Uncle Robert was introduced as the conference chairman and gave a blustering, self-congratulatory speech about his vision for the community, a vision that involved more luxury condos and fewer obstacles like the one I had represented for years. He received polite applause and retook his seat, beaming. Then the MC returned to the podium. "And now," he said, his voice resonating with importance, "it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a champion for our state in the capital, a leader with a profound commitment to smart, equitable growth. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Senator James Thompson." The room erupted in applause as the senator, a distinguished man with silver hair and an easy smile, made his way to the stage. He shook the mayor's hand, nodded to me warmly, and stepped up to the microphone. The applause faded. A hush fell over the ballroom. "Thank you," the senator began, his voice calm and authoritative. "Thank you, Robert, for that introduction and for bringing us all together today. The work of developing our communities is vital, and it requires collaboration, innovation, and most importantly, a deep understanding of the challenges our citizens face." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "Before I outline the specifics of the New Century Initiative, I want to acknowledge the single most important person in this room when it comes to the future of our community's development. The plan I am about to present is the result of years of tireless research and a brilliant policy framework that is truly visionary." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I knew what was coming. "For 8 years," the senator continued, his voice gaining strength, "this individual has been the unsung hero of countless successful social programs, fighting in the trenches for the most vulnerable among us. Her mind is one of the sharpest I have ever had the privilege of working with, and her integrity is absolute. The framework for the New Century Initiative is her brainchild, the culmination of her life's work thus far. I am deeply honored to have her as my senior policy advisor. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ms. Sarah Evans." He turned and gestured directly at me. A spotlight, brilliant and hot, swung from him and landed on me. For a moment, there was stunned silence, and then the applause began, starting with those at the front tables who knew my name and spreading throughout the room as everyone following the senator's lead got to their feet. I rose my legs, feeling slightly unsteady, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. And in that moment, I risked a glance at my family's table. The image will be forever burned into my memory. Uncle Robert's jaw was literally slack, his face a mask of utter slack-jawed disbelief. Aunt Carol, who had just sent me to the back of the room, was frozen, her hand halfway to her wine glass, her face draining of all color before turning a deep, mortified crimson. My cousins were staring, their mouths slightly agape, as if they were trying to solve a complex equation that simply wouldn't compute. And my parents, my dear, quiet parents. My father had his hands clasped over his mouth, and tears were streaming freely down his face. My mother was looking at me, her expression one of dawning, radiant, overwhelming pride. The applause was a roar in my ears, but the silence from their table was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The rest of the conference passed in a surreal haze. After the senator's speech, our table was mobbed. Business leaders, academics, and local politicians I had only known through email chains and memos crowded around, shaking my hand, congratulating me, and asking pointed questions about the housing initiative or the transportation bonds. I was no longer Sarah, the quiet niece. I was Ms. Evans, an authority. I answered their questions with the confidence born of expertise, my voice steady, my arguments precise. I was in my element, thriving in a conversation I had been excluded from my entire life. From across the room, I could see my family, a small, isolated island in the sea of my new reality. They didn't move. They just watched. Eventually, as the event wound down, they approached. It was a slow, hesitant procession, a delegation from a foreign land. Uncle Robert led the charge, his usual bluster completely deflated. His face was a painful mix of confusion and forced joviality. Sarah, my goodness, a senior advisor to the senator. Why on earth didn't you tell us? He boomed, though his voice lacked its usual force. It was a question, but also an accusation, a desperate attempt to reframe his ignorance as my secretiveness. I had no idea, Aunt Carol stammered, unable to meet my eye. When you said you worked for the government, I just assumed. Well, what you've accomplished is remarkable. The word remarkable came out as a squeak, an admission of a colossal misjudgment she couldn't yet process. My cousins hovered awkwardly behind them, their faces blank with a shock that hadn't yet morphed into a coherent emotion. But it was my parents I focused on. They pushed past the others, and my mother simply wrapped her arms around me, holding me tight. She was crying silently. Oh, Sarah, she whispered into my hair. All this time, all this hard work. We knew you were brilliant, we didn't understand. My father, a man of few words, put his hand on my shoulder, his eyes shining with a pride so fierce it felt like a physical force. You found your voice, he said, his own voice thick with emotion. You found it all on your own. I hugged them back, a genuine warmth spreading through my chest. Their pride was real and it touched me. But as I looked over their shoulders at my aunt and uncle, I felt nothing. Not anger, not triumph, not even a smug sense of, I told you so. The desperate childhood yearning for their approval, the validation I had craved for so long at their mahogany table, was simply gone. It had been extinguished not by the senator's praise or the ballroom's applause, but by the slow, quiet, solitary work of the last 8 years. My self-worth was no longer a fragile thing to be handed out or withheld by them. It was a foundation I had built myself brick by brick in basement offices and late-night study sessions. When the goodbyes came, my Uncle Robert tried one last time to reclaim control. We'll all go out to celebrate this weekend. My treat! The best steakhouse in the city. It was a clumsy offering, an attempt to purchase a stake in my success. I gave him a polite, distant smile. That's very kind of you, Uncle, but I'll have to check my schedule. The senator and I are flying out for budget hearings first thing in the morning. A car, not my parents' old sedan, but a black town car sent by the senator's office, was waiting for me at the curb. As I slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my skin, I saw them all standing on the sidewalk, my parents waving with joyful tears, my relatives looking small and bewildered under the hotel's bright awning. I had spent a lifetime looking at them, hoping to be seen. Now I was the one driving away. The destination was my own, and for the first time, I felt truly, completely, and peacefully free. I wasn't leaving them behind in anger. I was simply moving forward into a life they could never have envisioned for me. A life I had built not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right.